Welcome. Why unions matter, who they are, who they represent, what they do, why do we have them, and are they still relevant? I'm your host, Randy Barnett. I'm the assistant to the president, Perry Buckley, of the Cook County College Teachers Union, and we're very happy to have some very distinguished guests today. Dave Richmond, Vice President of the Suburban Faculty for Cook County College Teachers Union and a Professor of History at Harper College. Welcome.
Thank you, Randy.
And Sean Noonan, a Professor of Sociology at Harper College and the current Vice President of the Harper Faculty Senate. Thank you for being both here today.
Thank you, Randy.
And of course, as the disclaimer, the views presented here today are not necessarily the views of Harper College or the Cook County College Teachers Union. Either one of you, can you basically explain to me a little bit about what unions do?
Well, I'll try that one first, Randy. Unions are organizations that represent the workers that are either in a particular industry or the workers who work for a particular employer. And if you go back, originally unions started off as organizations to represent the interests or protect the interests of workers in very dangerous working conditions that used to be very unsafe to work in many of the factories and mines, etc. And the unions started off as protections against those kinds of environments. Over time, unions developed to represent the wider range of interests of workers. And today, the main function of a union is to negotiate or collectively bargain the wages, the hours, and the working conditions in a particular work site. Additionally, once a collective bargaining agreement has been reached, the union represents the workers should there be any disputes with management over the implementation of the collective bargaining agreement. And so they serve this ongoing role in the day-to-day work life at a work site. And then the third major role that unions play, I would say, is to work within the political environment, to represent interests of the working class politically, state, local, even national politics.
And Sean, would you agree with some of that, or do you have anything additional?
Absolutely, I would be in entire agreement with it, but I would just want to add that, sort of the logic of where unions come from, we exist in a really competitive labor market, and so capitalism is inherently competitive. And what you end up having is you have a large number of people trying to get jobs, but you actually ultimately have a small number of people with jobs to offer. And what this ends up doing is it gives a lot of power to employers in relation to employees. And so employers have a lot more power, and employees are sort of, if you go to your boss and you say, I don't like my wages, my hours, and my conditions as an isolated individual, it's sort of a take it or leave it world. The employer is likely to say, well, this is what I'm offering, or you can leave it. You have the freedom to exit and you can go elsewhere. Well, what happens is if employees get together and instead of trying to negotiate their wages, hours, and their conditions as isolated individuals, but instead come together and collectively bargain and say, no, we're all going to work for the same wages, the same hours, the same conditions, we'll work to get a contract. Under those sort of circumstances, it sort of levels the negotiating playing field between employers and employees. And so this is why you sort of see people coming together and saying, you know what, I'm not just an isolated individual. I'm not just one person without any connection to the other fellow worker. I'm not just an isolated person in relation to my community, the wider society. Let's come together and then collectively bargain and then sort of go to the employer and go, look, this is what we think we're worth in terms of those issues, wages, hours, and conditions. And then you end up with a more level playing field.
Yeah, unions, you really do try to create that sense of solidarity. There is a recognition that there are common interests, and this is why unions are typically organized either by job site, in other words, we have the common interest of working for this employer doing this process or this job, or in a particular industry, that all of us who do the same type of work have certain common interests. And so therefore, because those interests are related or they can be negotiated together. And as Sean has already indicated, that does make it possible to represent those interests of the workers. The phrase that is often used is to level the playing field between labor and management, between the working class and the ruling class, or the owning class.
And you think people, both of you, do you think people are better off now when they collectively bargain in a work environment?
Oh, most certainly.
And why is that?
Well, undoubtedly, I mean, workers, and Sean, I'm sure you can maybe throw in a few of the numbers for us, but workers who are represented by a union who will work under a contract do work for higher wages. They are far more likely to have benefits. They are far more likely to have retirement plans. They are less likely to leave their job. In other words, there's less worker turnover. There is a lot of benefits for the workers to being under a collective bargaining agreement.
In fact, I think both you guys have mentioned the fact that not only do unions help the people who are in unions, but often they help people who are not involved in unions also. They tend to help create the quality of life issues that the middle class of America is and the world is looking for. Is that also the case?
It's definitely the case. And just to sort of segue back for a second even, if you look at the wage differentials, having a union contract in the United States today raises wages for those organized workers about 11%. For female workers, for women under a union contract make about 14% more than women without a union contract. For African Americans, it's 18% more than without a union contract. And I think for Latinos, it's something like 22% more. So you can already see sort of, if you bargain collectively, you can put upward pressure on wages for working people, which is a fundamental matter of fairness. At some point, the economic pie of a society is only so big, and it's either going to go to the people that do the useful work and labor and make some meaningful contribution, or it'll go to people who are at the very top and already have a lot at the top of the society. Now, once you have that sort of in place, there's a whole slew of side effects that are sort of work at expanding that middle class in society when you have a large percentage of workers organized. It's not so common today, and we'll probably maybe get to that in a little bit, but there used to be a thing, collective bargaining is what it's called when you have a contract, but there used to be a thing, and it's still around a little bit, called connective bargaining, where even when workers don't have a contract, the contract down the road, the contract at the GM factory, frequently set the conditions at the Delphi parts plant back in the 60s and 70s. And so those workers that weren't literally organized, they also got the same wages, hours, and conditions as the workers that were organized down the road. Now, as a next step...
And in Harper College, that's exactly what's happening. Not everybody at Harper College is in a union, but those folks who are not also benefit from some of the same things that you guys have fought for over the years.
Almost
is that
certainly
not the case?
Absolutely. That, for example, the health insurance at the college is collectively bargained, but again, even those groups who are not in the union receive the same health insurance as the people who are. So there is that side benefit. And to Sean's point about connective bargaining, and sorry to cut you off, is this idea of a competitive labor market. In other words, that if you are an employer who wants to hire workers and retain workers, you are competing against that unionized work site, and so you have to at least be in the ballpark. And so it does put upward pressure on wages and benefits, even in non-union jobs. And that's a good thing for a healthy middle class. I think that was your original point.
And I think we also talked a little bit about the fact that the things that unions have bargained for the last 50 or 60 years in this country have also become a part of the standard of life as far as health care, as far as insurance, as far as all kinds of other benefits, retirement, 40-hour week in many ways. So a lot of the things that have been fought over the last 50 to 100 years in the United States has become a part of the quality of life of every American.
Oh, absolutely. The labor movement in the 1880s here in Chicago, not far from the studio, started the struggle for an 8-hour day, and it became federal law in 1936. And ask the historian what year it became federal law, but I think it was like 1936 that it became federal law. And so now we get to have weekends because of the labor movement.
Right. And healthcare and probably Social Security and some of the other issues that are part of the pension system and all of that.
Defined benefit pensions instead of just being thrown in the stock market, being guaranteed a certain amount of income, so that a pension used to be, well, let's make sure you're not poor, rather than, well, you have a chance of being a millionaire, but if you retire in a bad year, you'll be really poor. So all these sorts of issues come into play.
Or even just more basic, just the integrity of the worker's body. That there really was a presumption early on that if the working environment was unsafe, it was incumbent upon the worker to leave. The fact that you chose to work in a particular area meant that you essentially agreed to the working conditions, no matter how unsafe they were. Unions fought to put the burden upon the employer to say you are responsible for providing a safe working environment for the worker. That it's not the worker's, it's not required that the worker leave if the conditions are safe. It's required that the employer provide those conditions. And that's a basic or a fundamental right, is the right to personal safety. Unions fought for that. That didn't exist, at the start of the Industrial Revolution. But thanks to labor unions, we do have safer work conditions. We do have safer consumer protections as well. Safer products that are on the market. You mentioned, the weekend and the 8-hour workday. I mean, all
Minimum
these,
wage.
yeah, minimum wage laws. All of these things, Social Security, have been fought for by labor unions. That doesn't even begin to touch some of the other things like public education and civil rights, rights, for workers and minorities and other underrepresented groups. These are things that labor unions have historically fought for as well.
Now, the unions are under a great deal of stress and attack by a lot of different areas, and some folks said, let's give the unions their due for what they've done over the years, but maybe they've outlived their usefulness. Maybe they've done such a good job in providing for health care and wage and benefits and pension benefits that really they're no longer relevant anymore. Would you say is that a plausible argument?
Well, certainly no, I would say. I would say that unions have come under attack, to deal with the first part of your question. In recent years particularly, whenever there's an economic downturn, and of course we've been in the midst of a recession for several years now, even though technically we're no longer in recession, I think we're all still feeling the pain of that. That whenever we've seen these recessions in the last 100 years or so, there have been two targets that society has tried to blame, that we look for someone to blame for these conditions. And we've typically blamed immigrants and we blamed unions. And we've seen that in the last several years as well. That's no different. When unemployment is high, when people who have lost their wages, whose benefits have not been guaranteed or protected by a collective bargaining agreement, it's very easy to target those workers whose wages, hours, and conditions were protected. And it's more difficult to see sort of the grand or the larger macro causes. You just see, okay, what I don't have and what some other group does. And so unions have historically been targeted whenever there's an economic downturn, and we've been in the midst of one.
And do you think that's the case? That's why unions are under attack today, or because of the economic downturn has forced them into a situation where they have to defend themselves?
I think that is the case, but it's even the case when the unions aren't objectively the cause of that decline. Unionization rates have been declining. They peaked at about 35% in the mid-50s. They went down into the late 60s, early 70s, about 23%. These days they're around 11%. And the median household income from the end of the 2001 recession, before 2008 recession, median household income was flat for that entire period. So it wasn't like rising wages or the middle class was too big. What a crazy idea to even think about the middle class gets too big. But it wasn't like the middle class was too big or wages had gotten too high or inflation had run away. This crisis of 2008 was caused by real estate markets, by financial markets, by basically big business mismanaging the economy, but you end up blaming immigrants and working people and unions. And especially you see the turn against public sector unions because they're the one bastion of places where there's a higher percentage of workers that actually have union contracts. And so it's sort of going after, look at this, they're going after firefighters and cops, social workers and teachers in this day and age when the crisis was caused by bankers and real estate agents in Wall Street. And I think that objectively that's important to keep in mind because it's an illegitimate attack on unions. It's an illegitimate attack on immigrants and an illegitimate attack on working people as a whole.
In fact, it's a deflection, really,
Scapegoating.
from scapegoating, from their own culpability in a lot of the economic crisis to blame the folks who are least capable of causing that issue.
Right.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it is sort of ridiculous to think that immigrants and, like you said, 11% of the working class can bring down the economy. It really was, a top-down collapse. It wasn't a bottom-up collapse.
Do you both of you gentlemen think that unions have become part of the target for political leaders in the media because of the economic downturn, or because of what's the reason behind their venom?
I think the proximate cause is the crisis of 08. And so the reason why we're hearing about all of this today, the close-up proximate cause is because of the crisis of 08. But it's sort of one of these things where there's like multiple things happening. what back in the 70s used to be considered sort of the John Bircher position that all unions are inherently bad was almost like a far right sort of idea, and it's become increasingly mainstream in recent years. So you have some people that are just sort of philosophically or ideologically opposed to unions. You have some people that are just sort of conveniently sort of going after unions because, well, hey, I'll just pile on and these guys are anti-union and it's common, kind of popular to be anti-union right now. What's interesting about this, though, is if you sort of just watch TV or pay attention to the media, you'll think everybody hates unions. But the survey research is sort of interesting. About half of Americans say either I am in a union or I would like to be in a union. And you can word surveys all kinds of different ways, but the percentage of people that are like, oh, unions are bad, peaks at about a third of the population. There's a middle group that's sort of wishy-washy, but about a half of Americans are actually like, no, unions are sort of, what gave us the weekend, or, I know somebody who works down the road at Jewel and they have benefits much better than the person I know who works at Walmart. And so there's a commonsensical, even after all of this anti-union talk, what I find very interesting is there's still a sort of core resonance that working people coming together, sticking together, showing some solidarity, and especially in a culture that's so much about me, you sort of say, well, no, if we stick together and act as an us, things will actually be better. And I think that's a little ray of hope in response to all of these political attacks.
And
go ahead.
Just to add a little bit on that, I would also point out that unions are really one of the last areas in American society in 2012 that can organize people for progressive change, that can organize people politically for progressive change, that can put political pressure on politicians to account more for the interests of more for the interest of the worker and less for the interest of the shareholder. We've started to see some other options in the last year with the Occupy movement, for example, that's trying to fill the space that has been vacated by the decline of labor unions. As labor unions have become smaller and less impactful in the political arena, we've seen people trying to take up some of that slack in other areas. But labor unions are the one sort of truly organized institution left that can put progressive pressure on politicians.
Did either one of you guys ever see any kind of resurgence for the labor movement in this country or any place else in the world?
Well, certainly, part of the United States, when we talk about 11% unionization rates, the United States is very low but compared to the rest of the world.
Give me an example.
Well,
do you have some numbers
yeah,
from other?
Germany right now, Germany has about an 18%.
Okay.
Canada is up over 27%. Talking almost 2-3 times what the rates are in the United States. You go into Scandinavian countries where union membership is almost mandatory, and you're talking rates close to 70%.
Why?
Well, one is that there are laws that make it much easier for unions to organize. That a lot of what we've seen, the decline in union membership, is not, as Sean was saying, it's not because people don't want to be in unions, but because the roadblocks, the political roadblocks, the employer roadblocks that have been put in place, even in the last 20 years, you only have to go back very far, make it increasingly difficult to organize unions. We don't see a lot of unions decertifying. We've seen a lot of unions, jobs being shipped offshore, which has certainly hurt us. And we haven't seen the growth in unions because of these political and employer roadblocks. But other countries don't have those same problems, and we don't have this culture. They don't have this culture of anti-unions. You take Germany, for example. Germany has laws that says that in very large industries, large corporations, that unions have to have a seat on the board of trustees, and that actually share in the decision-making power. It's a much better relationship. It's a less antagonistic relationship with labor unions.
Well, let's go to some of the charges that the media and some of the politicians are making a little bit about. One of the claims is that unions drive up the costs of American industries. That we're paying more for something we can get for much less with a non-union.
Right. It's actually the case, as David was just talking about with Germany. You could look at Japan, you could look at much of Western Europe, where they actually have high-skill, high-waged economies. And so there's a conscious effort to sort of say, yes, we are going to pay more middle class wages. We are going to have a larger percent of the workforce under union contracts and able to have those good standards of living. But then there's also a focus on having high skilled labor, highly motivated labor. And so I reject that argument that somehow unions are just inherently bad or they just lead to uncompetitive industries, because I can point to what the World Economic Forum, a very elite organization, Soros getting together in Switzerland, talking about how to basically run global capitalism. If you look at their global competitive rankings, Sweden is almost always one of the top 3 countries.
And we just talked about that. They're having one of the highest percentage of labor workers, so
Right.
therefore it flies in the face of that issue.
And they export machines that make machines. The really high value commodities in the world economy, they export a lot of that sort of thing. And so it's entirely possible to have a high skill, high wage sort of economy, but we've sort of settled for offshoring our industrial base and settling on finance, insurance, real estate, and marketing. And I mean, it's just a coincidence, but it's funny. FIREM, FIREM, is sort of where we've landed as an economy.
And the union, the idea, again, a separate issue, but the idea that unions sort of just drive up wages and make American industries uncompetitive kind of goes back to something that Sean said just a few minutes ago, which is that unions really deal with an equitable distribution of profits. They don't drive up the costs. Costs are set by a market, right? Isn't that what all of us, we always hear about capitalism? It's all market driven. So all that unions do is determine who gets those profits. And unions are in the business of saying that we believe that a fair share of the profit should go to the workers, the people who are producing value, not necessarily to the shareholders. And again, shareholders are going to make their money. That's probably a given, at least today. But unions are in the business of making sure that some of that money or more of that money goes back down to the working class. And that's where we see that upward pressure on wages again. That's where we see a healthy middle class come from, is because more people can afford that kind of lifestyle based upon the wages they're given. It's not that they can drive up the overall costs. What they do is they divide up the distribution of profits.
Let's bring it closer to home. You both are in education, both faculty members. You have something that almost no worker has in this country. It's called tenure. Nobody has tenure that I know of, but faculty members and teachers. Why do you guys have tenure and nobody else has it?
Actually, to go back, it's almost like asking a different version of the same question. There's a lot of misunderstandings of what tenure is. First off, any tenured academic in the state of Illinois, at least at the community college, I'll talk about the level I know most about. At the level of community college, my supervisor, my dean can come in and fire me, no questions asked. Tenure doesn't mean you have a job for life. There's this sort of commonsensical notion out there that it means you have a job for life. What it means is you get to have a hearing to get your job back. And so what tenure really is due process for scholars and academics to be able to get their job back if they've been fired without cause. If you don't have tenure or a union contract, you're what's called an at-will employee, and your employer can fire you and not tell you the reason why, as long as it's not a protected class of person, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, and in some states your sexual orientation. But other than those sorts of things, they can fire you. And so tenure is a kind of due process to get your job back. It's not actually a job for life or a guarantee. And I just sort of said it a second ago, unionized workers also have that sort of due process. At least many union contracts and contain language that is a sort of, you have to be fired for cause, and there has to be sort of steps in the process of firing. So you won't be capriciously and arbitrarily fired. And I think that's a thing that, like, a lot of people, is sort of crabs in a barrel sort of thinking in American culture these days. When people do point at unionized workers, or they point at educators and they say, you have it better than me, you should be equally as miserable as I am, and you shouldn't have tenure, and you shouldn't have a union contract. And really, I think a basic American value and a basic sort of point of living in a democratic society is that if you lose something, you should have the ability to have some sort of process to make sure that it's not arbitrary, it's not capricious, it's not just whether the boss didn't like the way you combed your hair that day or something like this, that it's a legitimate reason for letting somebody go from a workplace.
Now, I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
I would just wanted to echo what Sean said, is that that anyone who, whether they have tenure or whether they're protected by a union contract, can be fired. It is just incumbent upon management or the administration to demonstrate there's just cause for the firing. And I would maintain, and as Sean just said, that every worker should have that same right, whether they're under contract or not.
And they don't have that right.
And they don't. In far too many cases, we've all heard the stories about, the guy who showed up to work on Monday wearing a Packers tie and got fired because his boss was a Bears fan. You shouldn't be fired because of which team you root for. You shouldn't be fired because of whether or not your hair was combed the right way.
I think I have to disagree with you.
Well, I understand a Packers fan may be a separate, may not be a protected category, but but the point is that there should be a due process for all workers, and tenure is nothing more than that due process. As college professors, we have to be able to talk about controversial topics that not everyone's going to agree with, and it is simply freedom of speech for the faculty member. But a faculty member who is not doing their job, who is harming students or not performing, can be fired just like anybody else.
There's a process in place.
Absolutely.
Right.
Now, another claim that a lot of the pundits in media and some political leaders are talking about is the fact that unions protect the incompetent workers in society, and there's just no way to get rid of incompetent workers.
Right.
Would you dispute that?
Actually, I would say, you know what? There are some unions that do that, and they're wrong when they do it. Management defends incompetent workers very often too, and they are especially keen to defend incompetent managers. It's a really shocking thing, isn't it? That managers do a bad job, and they manage to find a reason to keep on being managers, or heads of CEOs in their golden parachutes, or as a matter of fact, the talking heads on TV in 2007 before the crisis who thought everything was doing great and keep the housing market going, they're still the same talking heads on TV. So the whole issue of incompetence needs to be thought about concretely. Now with that said, there should be due process to get rid of incompetent employees, but no union should defend an incompetent employee. At the end of the day, you have to do your job. In our case, we're educators serving the public good, and we have zero interest in somebody who's a threat to our students, a risk to our students, or even just really bad at their job. That doesn't serve the public good. That doesn't serve the good of educating society and giving people more knowledge and more abilities to think about the complex issues of how we live in this advanced industrial democracy. So we're not in a position at all to sort of say, well, unions should ever defend the incompetent. But even the incompetent should have the right to due process. That's the sort of position to take.
And not to be too repetitive, but as I said a minute ago, that there isn't a unionized worker in the world who can't be fired. And so, if management does its job, then incompetent workers will be fired no matter what union tries to defend them. And so it is incumbent at some point for management to do their job as well.
And we talked a little bit about the percentages of American workers who are unionized, but there's been a precipitous decline in membership. And how has that affected? How is that line? I know we talked a little bit about it, but how has that affected America?
There's a real strong association between the decline in the percentage of workers that are in unions and the size and robustness of the middle class of the United States. So it used to be about 35% in the 50s, and you had a growing and strong middle class. By the late 60s, early 70s, it fell to about a quarter, and you still had a pretty healthy middle class in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. Today, we're at a point where 11% of all workers are organized, and the top 1% is capturing almost 25% of all income. Now, including that top 1, if you go down to the top 10, they're capturing half of all income. So you have an economic pie, half the pie goes to the top 10%, and the other half goes to the bottom 90%. That's what it looks like when you don't have enough people unionized. You have young people now under 30, they go and they do the right thing, they work hard, they go to school, they get their degree, and they go back to retail clerk and part-time. And so we have a whole generation we've sort of written off economically now. It's going to end up looking like a whole decade that's been lost because we don't have a big enough middle class in this society. And it's not the only cause, but I would argue it's the single biggest cause that the middle class is actually shrinking is the lack of unionized workers. And especially we have this sort of myth that only unionized workers were like blue collar guys with dirt under their fingernails. Back in the 20s when they introduced the first sort of de-skilled factories, they sort of said, oh, we solved the problem of unions because now these guys don't have any skills. They're nice, clean factories. We don't need unions anymore. It's always interesting that the story of what a union is. It used to be, oh, they were the high-skilled craft guys, and now they're the de-skilled manufacturing guys. It turns out you can unionize anything. It's just a vehicle of economic fairness, of voice, participation, and economic democracy in any workplace. As long as there's laborers there, they could actually be unionized.
It tends to be one of the great myths of the United States too, about the sort of the upward mobility, the idea that anyone can start off poor and we can become president. And certainly we anecdotally have those cases. But there's a measurement called the Gini index that tracks.
David, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We're getting to the end of the show,
Oh,
but
well,
thank
that
you
went
guys.
fast.
Good conversation.
Thank you guys for both being here today. It's been a very enlightening conversation.